Hello, everyone, and welcome to Database and Methods. It's a cyber seminar series hosted by VIReC, the VA Information Resource Center. Thank you to CIDR for providing technical and promotional support. Database and Methods is one of VIReC's core cyber seminar series. And it focuses on helping VA researchers access and use VA databases. This slide shows the series schedule for the year. Sessions are typically held on the first Monday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern. More information about this series and other VIReC cyber seminars is available on VIReC's website, and you can view past sessions on HSR&D's VIReC Cyber Seminar Archive. A quick reminder to those of you just signing on, slides are available to download. This is a screenshot of the sample email you should have received today before the session. In it, you will find the link to download the slides. Today's presentation is titled Assessing Race and Ethnicity in VA Data. It will be presented by Dr. Maria Mor. Dr. Mor is the co-director of the Biostatistics, Informatics, and Computing Core for the Pittsburgh site of the VA Center for Health Equity Research and Promotion, or CHIRP. As a collaborative statistician at CHIRP, she works with investigators on a variety of health services research projects focused on understanding and improving the quality and equity of health and healthcare for vulnerable populations of veterans, including racial and ethnic minorities, women, and veterans with chronic renal function and comorbid mental health conditions. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, I will hand things over to Dr. Mor.
Thank you for that introduction.
One moment, sorry about that.
I am not able to
Dr.
advance the
Mor?
slides. Yes, I'm having trouble advancing the slides.
Okay.
Well, I can do it this way.
Okay.
So for today's presentation, at the end of the session, you'll be able to locate race and ethnicity in the VA and Medicare data, assess the quality of the VA race and ethnicity data, and also create simple SQL code to use the data. We'll provide a brief introduction and then describe where to locate race and ethnicity in VA data, where to find the data in Medicare and Medicaid, how to assess the quality of the VA race and ethnicity data, recommendations to address those quality issues, along with some simple examples in SQL and links for where to go for more help. Before we begin, I do have two poll questions. The first question is, what is your role in research and/or quality improvement projects? Are you an investigator, a PI, or a co-investigator, a statistician, data manager, analyst, or programmer, a project coordinator, or other? And if you select other, please describe via the chat function.
All right, so that poll is now open. The answers are streaming in. Folks, just please remember, if you when you are answering these questions, please remember to hit submit for your answers to be recorded. And seems like things have slowed down for us quite a bit, so I'm just going to go ahead and close that poll. Sorry, go ahead and close that poll and share the results. We have 15% said A, 37% said B, 9% said C, 8% said other, and some of those are research assistant, epidemiology, program coordinator, and cancer registrar. And back to you, Dr. Mor.
All right, and then we just have one second poll question. How many years of experience do you have working with VA data? None, 1 year or less, more than 1 or less than 3 years, at least 3 but less than 7, at least 7, less than 10, or 10 years or more.
Great. Again, the poll is now open. We're just waiting for our answers to slow down a little bit, but they are streaming in. Just give that a few more seconds and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, seems like things have slowed down quite a bit, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share your results. And we have 10% said A, 15% said B, 15% said C, 16% said D, 4% said E, and 10% said F. And back to you.
So racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare persist in both the U.S. and in VHA. Within the U.S., access and quality have improved overall since 2000, but we do see disparities. Asians receive worse care than whites on about a quarter of measures, compared to 35 to 40% of measures for blacks and other minorities. And very few measures show any improvement in disparities for other minority groups. Within VA, racial and ethnic disparities persist even though financial barriers to receiving care are minimized. And although quality has improved, there are still significant within facility disparities that are observed in outcomes. So in order to address these needs, we need accurate race and ethnicity data. There are known issues with our data within VA. So the problems that we have is that data can be incomplete. That's probably one of the biggest issues that we have. We have inaccurate data. We have inconsistent data both over time and also between sites. The overall racial and ethnic distribution of veterans is about 77% white, about 12% black, 7% Hispanic, almost 2% Asian, about 1.5% are two or more races, and almost 1% are American Indian or Alaska Natives. However, the distribution that actually uses VA services does vary by race. Asian veterans are less likely to use, and Black and American Indian and Alaska Natives are more likely to use VA services. So the collection of race and ethnicity within VA does follow standards as laid out in this handbook. Our current reporting method is a two-question format. First, ethnicity is asked, where Spanish, Hispanic, and Latino are all considered Hispanic ethnicity. And then for race, we have 5 standard race categories that are collected. These are American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. And veterans are able to select more than one race if they are multiracial, and there's also an option to specify that the race is unknown. Prior to fiscal year 2003, race and ethnicity were captured jointly in a single variable. This variable allowed for the collection of both race and ethnicity for those who are white and black. So there were Hispanic white and Hispanic black categories. Use my laser pointer. There's also black and white categories, so these are presumed non-Hispanic. And then we have also categories of American Indian and Asian without respect to ethnicity. And the category of Asian did include Asian as well as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. So there was no option other than for those who are white or black to select ethnicity separately, and no option for multiple races. So data on race and ethnicity are acquired predominantly through patient self-report or through a proxy, such as a caregiver that comes in with the patient, but they can also be ascertained by a VA staff member, such as an enrollment coordinator or a clerk. The data are first acquired at the time of the application for health benefits on the Form 1010-EZ, and this form can be completed online, in paper, or with interview with a VA staff member. And data can also be obtained at any point of an inpatient or outpatient visit to a VHA facility. The data are currently entered directly into CPRS for most systems that are still utilizing the CPRS system. So where do we find data on race and ethnicity in VA? So before we get into that, I do have two more poll questions. The first question is, what sources of VA race and ethnicity data have you used? And please check all that apply. The first is CDW, OMOP, MedSAS, DoD, such as Vader or Da Vinci, or other VA data sources.
Thank you. So that poll is now open. Again, please remember to hit submit for your answers to be recorded. Our answers are streaming in, so we'll just let that run for a few more seconds before I close it out. All right, so it seems like things have slowed down quite a bit. I'm just going to go ahead and close the poll. And results are 42% said A, 6% said B, 10% said C, 11% said D, 16% said E. And back to you, Dr. Moore.
And then for the last poll question, in the next year, do you anticipate that you'll be using the Cerner or Millennium data? So the responses are already using, yes, you will be using, no, you will not be, or you are not sure.
And that poll is open. Our answers are coming in. We'll just have to let that run for a few seconds before I close it out and share the results to you. Okay, so things seem to slow down quite a bit, so I'm going to close that poll and share the results. We have 2% said A, 22% said B, 8% said C, and 30% said D.
All right, thank you very much. So when we look for data on race and ethnicity within VA, we do have data, as you can tell from the poll questions, from multiple data sources. And also, we'll also discuss that there have been a lot of changes to how the data have been collected and stored over time. So first, I'm going to talk about the data from the CDW, which is where I think most people have been using race and ethnicity data. So our VISTA data in the CDW is a national repository with race and ethnicity data from October 1999 from present. It contains one demographic record for each VA station a veteran has visited. It can contain standard and non-standard race values, where standard values would be one of the 5 categories that we had previously mentioned. And then VISTA racial data are available in the PAT-sub.patient race table in CDW VIReC. And there's 2 variables for race. We have race, which contains the newer collection standards or the existing standards, and legacy race from the older collection standards prior to fiscal year 2003. You would use both of these variables to obtain all available race data, but the legacy race variable may be of limited utility. In addition, we do have data that are coming back to us that's entered in Cerner in the Millennium data, and this is contained in CDW VIReC 2 and CDW VIReC 3. So CDW VIReC 2 contains the Millennium data in the Millennium data model, and CDW VIReC 3 contains a combined data between Millennium and our current CDW data that's in our current CDW VIReC data model. But there have been a number of changes that have been made to where race has been stored in the CDW data. The CDW data in general is subject to periodic changes, but race seems to have been one that's been changed more than other elements. And there's also been changes to the business rules for extractions that can lead to underlying differences in the data that we have. The current data structure, which contains the race variable and the legacy race variable and the PAT-sub.patient race table, is documented in VIReC's Patient 3.0 domain fact book. But we have other documentation on race and ethnicity, and they will show what is currently the legacy race variable as being stored in different locations. So you may see in that documentation that the data are contained in the patient or S patient table, And those tables used to have a variable called race SID, which could be linked to the cdwwork.dim race table to obtain the race, again, the old, what's now the legacy race variable for those individuals. Prior to that, in a prior iteration, the data were also still contained in the patient race table, but instead of being in a separate variable called legacy race, both the older and newer data methods were all stored in the variable race, but those from the older methods had a null value for the collection method. But as our data are currently stored, we have a variable called race, which is in the patsub.patientrace table. The data are at the level of the patient STA3N level, with the most recent data available for the patient. So we will not have a history, but we'll just have what's currently available. The data table can contain multiple records if a patient selects more than one race. So the race contains the newer data collection methods and may have more than one value in the table for those who are multiracial or select more than one. Collection method contains the method of data collection for the race. And then the legacy race variable contains the combined race and ethnicity variable prior to fiscal year 2003. Although this variable does not allow for multiple values, because it's contained in this table that may have multiple values for the variable race, that same value of legacy race will be contained on all records for the same patient SID if they happen to have multiple records in this table. Most patients do have a value of missing. So the data on this legacy race variable is not available in this data table for the vast majority of veterans. We also have non-standard race values in the CDW. This is largely a problem with the legacy race variable, where greater than 99% of entries are not standard. Partly that is due to slight differences in how the data were, the text of the data were recorded amongst sites, and also because the current standards were not the standards at that point of time. So the wording may have been slightly different. You may also need to standardize when you're using data from multiple sources. So an example of a non-standard race, there are several examples here, but for example, if we have Black, not of Hispanic origin, Black, non-Hispanic, these could easily be identified as belonging to the standard race of Black. Similarly, Pacific Islander would be Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. There are values that don't directly map to standard race, and those that include combinations of Asian or Pacific Islander, examples such as Mexican American or unknown. We can have multiple values of race in the CDW. This was assessed in 2013 in this guide, the CDW Race Data Multiple Races. At that point in time, they found that almost 2% of patients who had a standard race value had more than one value. That it wasn't possible to identify the most recent record for a patient. So their recommendation, if there are multiple values, were to only use self-identified races. These are going to be from our newer collection methods, if those are recorded, if those are available. Otherwise, you would use all recorded races for a patient without self-identified race. So that's essentially going to treat that veteran as though they are multiracial. Ethnicity in the CDW data is found in two tables. So those under their current collection methods are under patsub.patientethnicity, and those contain the values of Hispanic or Latino versus not Hispanic or Latino. But we also know that our legacy race variable is a combination of race and ethnicity, and so that is where you would find older data on ethnicity. And in addition, there are some non-standard values of race under the current collection methods that do contain information on ethnicity. This is predominantly from one site that has a white non-Hispanic group. Be aware that if you use the legacy race variable, that not all race ethnicity values indicate ethnicity. And then we have in CDW Work 3 the combined data from CDW Work and Millennium, and this will be in the CDW Work data model. So the views have the same names as what's found in CDW Work, but they have the suffix _EHR. So we have the DIM tables for race and ethnicity are going to be race_EHR, ethnicity_EHR. And then the patient tables will have patient race_EHR will contain race. We can identify the data that's coming from the Millennium data because they will use STA3N equals 200. And that's how you can differentiate between our CDW data that's coming from Vista versus our data that's coming from Millennium. However, with the Millennium data, currently all we have is one value of race per person across all of VA. So we do not have a value of race per site per person. It's all across all of VA, and we do not currently are not able to get the multiple values for people who are multiracial. And then the patient ethnicity_EHR would then contain the combined ethnicity data. So I'm showing here an example of the values that are in the CDW Work 3 DIM race table. It does contain the combined values that are possible both in Millennium and CDW. However, in the Millennium data, two things to note. First of all, there's a lot of values that are available in Millennium that are not used in VA, and so I've kind of cheated here, and I've just put the ones that are actually used because Cerner is used in a lot of systems outside VA, and they just have a lot of other options. We can identify the Cerner data because we see STA3N equals 200, and all of these race codes would then be consistent across all of VA once everybody transitions to the Millennium data. And this DIM table contains both this Millennium data, but then it also contains the site-specific values that we're used to seeing in the CDW. And I would like to refer you to site number 75 for more resources on the data integration with the Cerner data. So the CDW Work 2 contains the data that we're getting, the Millennium data, in the Millennium data model. Right now, it's predominantly used for operations, and there's limited research use at this point in time. There is an equivalent of a DIM table in CDW Work 2. This is in dimmil.code value. Unlike the CDW Work DIM files, where you have essentially a separate DIM file for each construct, this is essentially one giant DIM table that has code value sets for everything in that table. So if you wanted to find the race codes, you'd have to use code value set ID equals 282, and you'd use the value of 27 for the ethnicity code values. And as we alluded before, this is going to contain many values for race and ethnicity that are not used in VA. However, the data that are stored in the CDW Work 2 veteranmil.person or sveteranmil.sperson table already contains the display values. So you wouldn't actually have to link back to this DIM table unless there was additional data contained in that table that you were interested in. Again, the data are one value per person for the person level race and ethnicity data. The table does contain both the display values and the SIDs that you would use to link back to this DIM table if you were interested. And the variable with the display value for race is race CD for race code, and for ethnicity is ethnic group CD for ethnic group code. We also have standardized data on race and ethnicity available in OMOP. And the goal behind OMOP is to use a common data model to map and standardize data. The data on race and ethnicity are contained in the OMOP V5 person table, and these are going to be the data that come from our existing CDW Work data. What's going to be different is not that there's new or additional data, just that business rules have been applied to create one standard value for race and ethnicity for each person ID, which is the identifier used in the OMOP data. You can map this identifier back to other CDW identifiers. And these data do exclude non-veterans, test patients, and possible test patients. So the business logic that they use in order to come up with this one standard race value is based on two guides here, the CDW Race Data and Multiple Races Guide, and the VIReC Researcher's Notebook Using SQL to Sort Out Race in CDW. The data, the original documentation referred back under an old data structure, but it would now be the legacy race variable in the patient race table, along with the race variable in the patient race table. They have 6 categories for race. They are the 5 standard categories that we collect for race, plus unknown. And the business logic that they use to identify race in OMOP is going to be based on prioritizing the newer collection methods in self-identified race and using the most frequently occurring value. So they will select the most frequently occurring self-reported race will be the race value that is identified in OMOP. If that doesn't exist, then they will use the most frequent non-self-reported race followed by the race at the patient's preferred institution, or if they will try to identify the most recently edited value. And finally, if all of those, that hierarchy fails, then they'll have a value of unknown. So similarly, ethnicity will be contained in the OMOP data. The values, again, will be Hispanic or Latino, not Hispanic or Latino, with an unknown. Just as for race, they will prioritize the newer collection methods and the self-identified race before using old, data from the older collection methods. Data on race is also available in DaVinci, which is joint DoD and VA data. That will use a similar classification as our VA data, although the Asian and Pacific Islander will be contained in a single category, and as well as there's also an other category. In addition, there is a combined race ethnicity variable, which was going to prioritize Hispanic ethnicity as its own category. And so then we see like white not Hispanic and black not Hispanic for those who are not classified as Hispanic. And then finally, we also have data on race and ethnicity that are available in the MedSAS data, which was our predominant research data for use prior to the CDW. It contains data in a variable called race that contains data from the older collection methods prior to 2003. After 2003, the data are contained in multiple values for race 1 through race 7, are 7 different variables. There are 7 variables, 5 for the standard races, 1 for unknown, and 1 for decline to answer. And there's a single value for ethnicity captured in the variable ethnic. Under these newer collection methods, both race and ethnicity have a length of 2 characters, and the first character denotes the race or ethnicity, and the second character has a method of data collection. Unlike the CDW data, these are encounter-level race and ethnicity data, so you will have the history of what had been in the record at the time of the patient encounter. It will not be the most recent data. It will be if the visit occurred in 2010. It will be what had been on that date in 2010. Inpatient data are available from 1976 onward, and outpatient data from about 1997 or 1998 onward. So prior to fiscal year 2003, the data are collected using that combined race and ethnicity values that we had previously seen. They do have a code of 7 to denote those that are unknown or the value could be missing. And then for the current data collection standards, they have the 5 standard races, decline to answer plus unknown. Just note that the first character for race does not intuitively map to any of these, so don't just think, oh, it's B, that's going to be black. You actually need to look and see what's in the documentation, and missing values are blank. Similar with ethnicity, we also have decline to answer unknown, and missing values are blank. And then the collection method, and these are the same options that we'll also have in the CDW data, are going to be self-identified, proxy, observer, or unknown which is supposed to mean that the patient doesn't know it, but this is also used as a catch-all for unknown. So where do we find race and ethnicity data in Medicare and Medicaid? So in Medicare, we have two predominant sources in which data are available. The easiest to obtain is data from the VA vital status file. It does require that you complete a separate rules of behavior for using those data, but otherwise they are readily available. If you're familiar with the VA vital status file, there's two files. There's a mini file, which is one record per person and has a subset of variables. That subset does not include the CMS_race variable. You have to use the master file, which contains one record for each Social Security number, date of birth, gender combination found in the VA data. So you can have more than one record per person. You can also obtain data if you apply through, I guess it's VIReC, that you would apply to the CMS data for and go through that application process. But then you can get like the denominator and enrollment files that will get you data on race and ethnicity from Medicare and Medicaid. In the Medicare denominator file, there's both a race variable, which corresponds to the CMS_race variable from the vital status file, but there's also an imputed race variable called RTI_race, which we'll discuss in a minute. And then the Medicaid also has information on race and ethnicity. So for the Medicare data, it's potentially a useful source of information as long as the veterans are enrolled in Medicare. So approximately 95% of those aged 65 and older are enrolled in Medicare, and approximately 20% of those under the age of 65 are enrolled. And those are predominantly those who are disabled, but can also include those who have a diagnosis of end-stage renal disease. The data do come from the Social Security Administration, and they're obtained at the time of application for Social Security number or replacement card, and they come either from the individual or typically from a family member. Unlike our current VA race and ethnicity data, Hispanic is a separate race category, is not captured separately, and there's no option for multiple race reporting. Furthermore, until 1980, only 4 categories were collected, which were white, black, other, and unknown. After 1980, other was replaced by Asian American or Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and American Indian or Alaskan Native. And just to point out that because Social Security numbers are typically applied for at birth, so you're really looking at still most veterans are going to have data that were captured from the Social Security Administration prior to 1980. And then, as we mentioned before, there is an imputed race variable called RTI_race. Research Triangle Institute created and implemented an algorithm to increase the accuracy of the race variable, especially for Hispanic and Asian individuals. Their algorithm used the first name, last name, preferred language, and place of residence, and they were able to improve the sensitivity of racial codes from 30% to 77% for Hispanic and from 55% to 80% for the Asian Pacific Islander group. There are data quality issues with the Medicare data. As we've already mentioned, we may have a lot of patients, a lot of veterans who are in that catch-all other group because their Social Security numbers were obtained prior to 1980. And we also only have a single question without multiple race reporting. There have been initiatives to improve the data quality. In addition to the RTI race algorithm, there have been periodic updates from the Indian Health Services, along with a 1997 survey of enrollees who were classified as other or unknown or who had a Spanish surname that requested self-reported data on race and ethnicity. The Medicaid race and ethnicity variable contains data that's more similar to our VA current standards. The big difference is that they still have Asian would include Asian plus a Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. There is a summary variable that contains information on both not only like if they're Hispanic or Latino, but if they have other race available, if they don't have other race available, or also if they're multiracial. You can get that information from their summary variable. But in addition to that summary variable, there are the individual codes for the ethnicity and race 1 through race 5 that would allow you to identify what the specific races were. The availability of the Medicaid data lags behind both VA and Medicare. So Medicare is usually a year or two behind the VA data, which is typically current and up to date, and then Medicaid is another couple years behind that. We also have fewer enrollees in Medicare, so approximately 10% of our VA enrollees are also enrolled in Medicaid, and these data have also been subject to changes in collection over time. So now we're going to discuss a little bit about the quality of the VA race and ethnicity data. So the first issue that we have is with the completeness of the race data. In 2012, there was a guideline, the CDW race data at multiple races, that identified that, we've known this as well, that the acquisition of race and the completeness of the race data has changed over time. And so by looking at the year of the most recent activity for the individuals, they could see that, prior to the data changes in fiscal year 2003, data were missing for about half of the patients. Once we implemented the data collection changes around 2003, the amount of non-missing data has improved dramatically. Here in 2012, it was about 85% had data available. As of 2018, it's about 92%. That's about where we are now. Amongst those, we still have issues that we have about 1% who are coded as multiracial, and then about 0.3% who have conflicting values. When we use the data from the older data collection methods, less than 1% of veterans only have data from the older race data. So it's not really helping us in filling this gap that we have in the availability of race data. And we also have more conflicting values. About 1.3% of those with the older race data have conflicting values. There was a similar guide that looked at the completeness of the CDW ethnicity data. They found at that point in time, around fiscal year 2012, that among all patients in the CDW, about 61% did have ethnicity recorded. But when you look at fiscal year 2012, again, the number who have data available has gone up dramatically to about 88%. As of now, it's going to be greater than 93, 94% who have ethnicity data available. There still can be issues with conflicting values with ethnicity because the data can be collected from multiple sites. So they still found about 1% who had conflicting values. When we look at the medical SAS data, again, we'll see the similar trends that the older data had a lot of missing values. The newer data are far more complete, greater than 90% complete. But what I really want to point out is that the completeness can vary between the inpatient and outpatient files. Even though the underlying data sources that feed into those files could be different, there seem to be some differences in the business logic and how those were transferred. And so sometimes you might find like there were some years where there were many sites where ethnicity wasn't even put into the outpatient data files. And then there are other years where there's issues with the inpatient data. So you need to use the data from both the inpatient and outpatient sources if you're using race and ethnicity in the MedSAS files. And so finally, I'm going to discuss a project by Kevin Stroop and colleagues that was published in 2010 that did a comparison between VA and non-VA data sources. Although this was published a few years ago, the trends that they've seen in the data still hold to be true. The aims for their study was to estimate the extent to which missing usable race data in what was in the VA MedSAS files could be reduced by using non-VA data sources, and the sources they used were Medicare and DoD. They also evaluated the agreement between the VA self-reported race data and the Medicare and DoD race data. Their cohort was a 10% representative sample of VA patients who obtained services during fiscal years 2004 to 2005, resulting in a sample of over 500,000 veterans. Because of the time frame in which they were looking at their data, about half were missing usable race from the VA data sources. So today we would know it would be closer to 10%. But once you condition on those who are missing data, the other results really still hold. So among those who are the age 65 and older, about 95% of those who are missing VA race data had usable Medicare data. For those under the age of 65, they used both the Medicare data and the DoD data. Because of the time frame in which the DoD data were collected and available, it really wasn't a useful data source for those who were older. But between the Medicare and DoD data, those under the age of 65, only about half of them had usable data from either data source. So there's a huge disparity in the ability to fill in missing data based on age, where you can get almost complete data for those over the age of 65, whereas you still have a significant amount of missing data for those under the age of 65. They also compared the concordance between the VA and non-VA data sources. And again, this is another result that holds time and time again when we look at the data. The agreement is generally very good for white and African American groups. But as soon as you look at non-African American minorities, the agreement is poor. So this would be, Hispanic, Asian, et cetera. In addition, they found that Hispanics tended to be coded as white most of the time rather than Hispanic in the Medicare data. So they were more than twice as likely to be coded as white than Hispanic. Furthermore, in order to utilize the data from all these data sources, because you didn't have the same granularity in the data collection, they did have to collapse Asian Pacific Islanders and other minorities into a single category. So what are the recommendations for addressing these quality issues? So the first thing that we need to note is that, with the change to the Cerner health record and getting the data on our Millennium data, things are going to change. Currently, Millennium has one value of race and ethnicity per person, so there's no issues of conflicting information by site or multiple values per person in the data that we're getting currently from Millennium. However, within the data that we currently have from CDW work that is coming from VISTA, we still have these issues. And the general recommendations are, when there's multiple sources of race and ethnicity, to use data from the newer collection methods if available, and only consider the legacy race data if newer data are not available. Again, because those data may not be potentially helpful, it may also be okay just simply not to use these data. If conflicting values are present, you could prioritize values from specific sites if it's relevant for your projects. For example, if you have an index site or an index visit, or you're enrolling patients from a particular site, or if you use like the patient's preferred institution, those may be ways to prioritize a site. Other ways, you may consider using all recorded values. And then just as a reminder, when using MedSAS data, you want to obtain race and ethnicity from both the inpatient and outpatient files. Use of non-VA data can reduce missing data. You do want to carefully consider any potential bias, such as age or disability, in the outside data sources. So I think that the Medicare data is the easiest data for us to obtain, but we know that there are biases in who has Medicare data available. You may need to classify and collapse categories in order to get better agreement or even to match up between other data sources. Potential supplementary data sources include Medicare, DoD, Medicaid, special surveys, and then I also want to specifically mention that U.S. Vets data is also available for researchers now. You would still consider the data that comes from U.S. Vets as though it's sort of like an imputed race variable, so that it's perfectly fine for making aggregate and statistical comparisons between groups. But we found that I think in using a combination of the VA data, Medicare, and U.S. vets, we've been able to reduce the amount of missing data that we have to less than 1%. So when you use Medicare data, you just have to make sure if you're using the vital status file that you do match on both on all three of birth, date of birth, gender, and SSN. Keep in mind that the Medicare data cannot be used to identify Hispanics with accuracy or completeness. And so if this is a group of particular interest, you should consider using the imputed RTI race variable, because this will greatly increase your ability to identify Hispanics and Asians. Again, you're going to use this in an aggregate and in a statistical manner. You don't necessarily know that any one particular individual who's coded as Hispanic or Asian actually is. And finally, we're going to go over some brief examples in SQL. I do want to mention these guides for using SQL or the race and ethnicity data, but just please note that the data structure, since these were put out, has changed, and so you'll want to go back and refer to slide 21 that just clarifies what those changes were. So for our first example is to look at the patient race table and just do a simple frequency of the underlying values. And in this case, we can see that we do have some values that are null. I would like to point out this is not the extent of those who are missing patient race data. It's just those who have values in this table that are coded as null. So most veterans who are missing race data will simply not have a record in this table. And then also here's our non-standard value in our newer race data that's white, not of Hispanic origin. Otherwise, we can see that the most of our veterans are white, followed by black, and we do have data that are unknown or declined. Similarly, for ethnicity, we can summarize those data. Most veterans are not Hispanic or Latino. We have declined and unknown. In this particular case, we don't have very many null values, but again, patients that are missing these data will just simply not have a record in the table. And then we can also see the collection method. And what I really want to point out is that these data default to self-identified. It's a default value, and it's rarely changed. So when you, if you go back and look at some of these older guidebooks, they really emphasize the self-identified race, and that was this big thing about our new change in our data collection method. But the reality is that we cannot say with certainty just because it's coded as self-identified that it truly is. So typically, people actually don't tend to use this variable because it's not considered to be particularly accurate. And then finally, I wanted to show you data from the legacy race variable. A couple things to note is, first of all, when we use these data, I'm using the select distinct to remove the duplicates because I can have multiple values per patient SID. The vast majority of the data are missing. We see values here that are not standard and based on our current standards, and this is just a subset of the values that are available. So there's about 40 total values in that table. We can use a lookup table to help in order to translate those non-standard values to standard values. And so when we do that, another thing to note, you know, we have 10 people are listed as Asian, 6 as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. This is really telling us that not only do we know that most of the data are missing, but we really don't have, we know based on our older data that we have more than 16 people who are Asian or Pacific Islander. These data are really not being loaded into this variable. And so this is another reason why I tend to shy away from using it or recommend it. We know it's just simply not a complete representation of the older race values for these individuals. I am going to show you an example that uses a lookup table. I do like to use lookup tables. I like to use them a lot in SQL. I think it's really set up nicely to use them. It's a nice way to standardize values, whether you have non-standard values or values from different data sources. I also like to add indicator variables directly to my lookup table. And you can easily look at your lookup table, change the categories to match your project needs. This particular example does not address the large number of non-standard values used in legacy race. Since I'm kind of shying away from telling people to use that, I didn't want to get bogged down in that particular example. But the lookup table that I used on the prior slide is available in the Race Data Best Practices Guide, and their code for creating that table starts on page 10. If you don't want to use a lookup table and you just want to, kind of program in the standard way, then you can also use the researcher's notebook using SQL to sort out race for that purpose. So for my example, I'm going to use data from CDW Work 3 because it's going to combine our most recent data from Vista and the Millennium data. I don't want to use these unused values that are in Millennium. I'm going to focus on the utilized value by selecting the actual values in the patient race underscore EHR table. We have a total of 12 different values. SQL is case insensitive, so I could have Black or African American in mixed case. May also appear in my data, but it's only going to, for distinct values, only one will show up here. These look like they may be a difference between case, but it's actually this word other. And so when I convert this to standard values, I'm going to, again, select all distinct values. I'm going to get my 12 values. And, I've chosen, in this particular example, that I like the mixed case. So I'm going to convert everything to mixed case. That's the uppercase. I've also decided that all of these different ways of classifying missing values I don't really care about, so I'm going to classify them as null. You could do this differently for your study. You could put them in different categories. You could make a group that's explicitly called missing. But just for this example, I've labeled them as null. And then again, we have this one non-standard value of race that has race and ethnicity. And then furthermore, based on these standardized values, I'm going to create my indicator variables. So why would I do this in a lookup table? My lookup table has 12 values in it. And so I can easily program everything on my 12 values. The processing time is cheap. If I have data on millions of veterans, I'm not doing all of this processing on all of those millions of records. I would like to note, in addition to creating these indicators for each race, I'm making sure that if the value for race is null, that my indicator is also null in this example. And I also decided I'm going to create an indicator for this variable that has information on race and ethnicity. So this is what my final table looks like. I can print this out. I can see here are the race values that occurred. Here's how I've standardized them. Make sure that my indicators are as I want. When you're using this table in SQL, it will not join on null values. In my case, because my resulting values here are all null, that's okay. But if you wanted to map these to a missing category, you're going to have to program that separately. And although SQL will join if the variables have the same text but different case, if you're doing this in SAS, which is case sensitive, then you have to make sure that you account for that appropriately. So where do you go for more help? First of all, VIReC has a page just on race and ethnicity on the intranet. And this has all the links to all the guides that I've mentioned are in here. There's also lots of resources on the electronic health record modernization. You can get specific questions answered. You can go to the listserv. You can subscribe. I'm going to highly suggest if you have a question for the listserv that you check their archive first. You can get individual questions from the help desk. This is just a link to other resources. My contact information is also here in the slide deck. And I have I barely left any time if there are questions. I would like to answer them.
Okay, so there are some questions.
Okay.
Let's start with, does race collection at inpatient, outpatient encounters also allow third-person reporting, or is this only at enrollment?
Yes, they also allow third-person reporting. So that would be another time where you might have like a caregiver, or historically as well, the question might pop up on the screen, and because we've done studies where sometimes the clerks have been uncomfortable asking the question, and they might, like that pops up in an encounter, they look at the veteran and they make their own determination, and they just put it in. So it could come from any of those sources, the proxy, the veteran, or the staff.
Okay. Is there an estimate percentage-wise on self-reported versus observed or captured by staff on race and ethnicity data?
Not that I know of, because the problem is that variable, as I said, it defaults to self-identified. In the past, when we've observed, we've actually gone in the clinics and observed them. Like, we've asked them, like, do you even know how to change this default? And they didn't even know how to change it. So I don't think we really have any good data on what that true breakdown is. I'm sorry, you were breaking up for me. Can you repeat that question?
Is the race you patient race domain? Did you hear that?
Okay. I heard part of it. I think you're asking if the race logic in OMOP is the same as the CDW patient domain. So if that is the question, they're actually different. The patient domain is just listing the data that are recorded, whereas OMOP is taking the data that have been recorded and applying business rules in order to create a single value per person. So it is based on the patient race table, but it's not exactly the same because it has applied those business rules.
Okay, thank you. And then hopefully you can hear me. How do you identify a patient's preferred institution?
Oh boy, I'm not sure. I know it's in there, but I can't tell you the variable offhand. But can we collect that information so that we can make sure we get back to this participant with that information?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Okay, so what's the difference between unknown and missing?
So typically unknown means that they've asked and they've actually received a response of unknown. One of the big differences between unknown and missing is that if you explicitly code it as unknown, it no longer pops up that this is a question that needs to be answered. And so there's incentive, if it's not known, to actually put it in there, or maybe even potentially somebody's uncomfortable asking the question, just to put an unknown, so that it doesn't pop up, when you're seeing a patient, that this is a missing item that needs to be answered.
Okay.
But it should mean that the question was asked.
Okay. So the last question, I think, was referring back to slide 12, and they wanted to know, what did worse care mean? Or was it a poor care responses, or we have...
Let me see if I can go to, oh my gosh, I'm trying to get back to slide 12. And my thing goes away on me. That was why I was having trouble. Okay. Okay, so in this respect, what is going to be defined as worst care is based on the quality measures that they have, and these may be quality measures that include, oftentimes these are even just access to care. So what it means is that you have fewer people that are making that metric as meeting the goal for that quality measure.
Okay, I'm just making sure. It looks like there's some more questions that came in. What are business rules?
So when we say business rules, it's when you operationalize some sort of logic in order to, program the underlying data that we see. So I guess usually I think we refer to it as business rules because we think of it like Bizzle or somebody has created these. It's not like me as a researcher that's created and implemented it, but it's like the underlying programming behind the data tables that we're seeing.
Okay, and looks like the final question Is there any initiative to improve the way we can dive into the intersections of race and ethnicity? For example, newly developed combined race ethnicity census questions.
So I don't know about that. So one thing, I was kind of initially hoping to get this session a little bit later in the kind of in the series. I am involved with a group that is looking at, they're using e-screening in order to collect information on race and ethnicity so that they know that it's data that's coming directly from the veteran without like the staff member, you know, if they're uncomfortable with the question, not asking the question. But they also were asking specific questions. So if somebody does not answer like data on race or ethnicity, then there are also follow-up questions about why they're not asking it. And part of it is this issue that that veterans who identify, or not just veterans, but oftentimes people who identify as Hispanic may also consider that their race, and that they, you know, don't then want to identify a race separate from that. So that was one of the issues that they were trying to get at with those questions. But, you know, because of COVID, that project kind of got delayed. And so I'm hoping at some point that we'll have some data that we might be able to share on that.
Okay. Well, Dr. Moore, thank you so much for taking the time to present today's session. Since we're at the top of the hour, to the audience, if your questions were not addressed during this presentation, you can contact the presenter directly. You can also email the VIReC help desk at virec@va.gov. Please tune in to the next session in VIReC's Database and Methods Cyber Seminar Series on Monday, May 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. Doctors Bonnie Paris and Joshua Thorpe will be here to present an introduction to VA pharmacy data, sources and uses for medication information. We hope to see you there. Thank you once again for attending. We'll be posting the evaluation shortly. Please take a minute to answer those questions and let us know if there's any data topics you're interested in. We'll do our best to include those in future sessions. Thank you.